Hi Holly, this is my video response for January 31st. I'm going to be discussing Madison's Intro to Critical Ethnography as well as Goodall's writing the new ethnography, and then Van Manen, Tales of the Field. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about is Madison's work. So she opens up with this story about a documentary that she saw about this woman who was living in Ghana, and she had a problem with the documentary because she thought that there was a dangerous misrepresentation taking place in which all of the human rights activists in that area were being erased from the story entirely, and so she had a problem with the way that, and so she had a problem with how representation was being enacted in the film. And so a lot of what she is talking about in this introduction, and I imagine in the book, is because even with good intentions and relatability of any given story, representing others is always a complicated process. So she says that representation has consequences, and that how people are represented is how they're treated, and that interpretation holds a great deal of power. So when she just kind of defines some terms here in the introduction, I'm just kind of briefly going to go over the ones that she discusses. So she talks about critical ethnography and how there is an ethical responsibility there to address power and injustice, and that there needs to be compassion for the suffering of others. She said that critical ethnography disrupts the status quo, and as it uses resources and skills and wants to give voice and experiences to the subjects whose stories the ethnographer is trying to tell. So she says that politics are incomplete without self-reflection and without considering one's own positionality. She says that positionality is important because it is the process by which we acknowledge our own power in relationship to one another's, and that it's important to not only critique our objectivity, but our subjectivity as well. So she also talks about dialogue and the importance of dialogue. So when we're talking about positionality, we're talking about things that are beyond our subjective selves, and it's more about how we are in relationship to one another and how that informs our engagement with other people and our relationships to them. So dialogue, she says, is this quintessential encounter with others, and it's a type of communication with other beings that brings the self more fully into being. And when the other is engaged dialogically, you're doing critical ethnography. She also discusses theory and method, saying that they're the same and they're different, and that when theory is used in ethnography, it is interpretive. It is an interpretive and analytical method, and so ethnography is essentially critical theory in action. And she kind of maintains that our methods should be contingent on our purpose, and that our theory should inform our work in the scene in which we're working itself. So for Madison, kind of the key points of importance are making sure that critical ethnography addresses our positionality, so it's ourselves in relationships with other people, and there has to be attention to the ethnographer also being attentive to their own story and how their own story is informing their perceptions of the others that they are observing, and how it is also informing their self and how their self is evolving in conversation with the other. Dialogic engagement is also important for her in that the way that an ethnographer communicates with the population is something that is has reciprocity, it's back and forth, and it's always negotiating the self in relationship to the other, being mindful and critical of the self and the self's positionality. So constructions of power and issues of power are really important for Madison in conducting critical ethnography. The next that I'm going to talk about is writing the new ethnography. So, it said that in this piece that the goal of fieldwork is to recognize patterns, and then the goal of ethnography is writing about those patterns. So what's being discussed is new ethnography, and by new ethnography, that means that the creative narratives that are shaped out of a writer's personal experiences within a culture and addressed to academic and public audiences. So the traditional scholarly essay is not really a place to try out experimental forms of writing, but this was challenged with the crisis of representation, and out of this came the notion that cultures are constructed, and that the point of new ethnography is that new ethnography as writing is writing that rhetorically enables intimacy in the study of a culture, and new ethnographers want readers to take what they say personally, and they want their words to make a difference in a reader's lives. So all ethnographers are telling two stories. They're telling the story of the population that they are studying, and they're also always telling the story of themselves. So this kind of brings back in, again, that reflexivity and that dialogic engagement and that acknowledgement of one's own subjectivity and even further positionality. New ethnographers have an obligation to write about their lives, and this requires that observations and evaluations are firmly rooted in self-reflexive voices, so this kind of constitutes a self-examining or self-reflexive narrator. Additionally, new ethnographic writing should be a personal quest. It is a way into the self and a way into one's own culture. And this writing should be a process of inquiry in which you write to learn about yourself, but then you can also write about what you've learned for a particular audience. So this performance of writing is always relational. It is an attempt to create a pattern and for an intended audience. So in that sense, good writing is transformational, and the deal with the pattern is that the author is supposed to write in a way in which it helps the reader discover the pattern. So it's more than just a simple process of identification. It is a process in which the story told could just as well be the reader's own. So he also says that, or she, I'm not sure, that great writing is naturally dialogic, and that writers write to discover, and they write for audiences that are outside of themselves. And that it's important for writers to connect readers to larger patterns of lived experience and cultural meaning, and writers want to learn to find storylines by paying attention to themselves in relation to the details and patterns of everyday life. So again, this theme of reflexivity in writing, this idea that the conversation should be relational, so it's not representational, it's relational, so it's always about the relationship between and among things instead of things standing in for something else. Tales of the Field discusses how ethnography is, first of all, notes that ethnography is highly particular and hauntingly personal, and it's discussing how social reality is conveyed through writing and how that involves an authorial voice. So ethnographers, in this instance, are said to be, they're somewhere between writers who seek to reach general audiences and those who reach just a specialized or particular few. Also, themes of the problems of representation are present in this work as well, and it's even said that the representational problems are central to ethnography itself. So method discussions of ethnography should consider the relationship between culture and behavior, the experiences of the field worker, so then again you have that reflexivity, representational style, so how the ethnographer chooses to join themselves, the observer, and the population that they are observing, and then the role of the reader that's engaged in a reconstruction of the tale. So the role of audience is important here too. So ethnography is defined in this piece as portraits of diversity in an increasingly homogeneous world, in which ethnography is an isolated and highly personal business, and also a written representation of a culture or selected aspects of culture. So ethnographic writings are forms of human conduct. Fieldwork is defined here as a means of living with and living like those who are studied, a full-time involvement that generally occurs on the home ground of those being studied. And it's also noted that accident and happenstance shape field workers' studies as much as do planning and organization. So it's also those impulses that form an ethnographic study as much as it is the rational choices that an ethnographer may make. Culture is talked about at length here, and there's a discussion of how culture is created and represented and constituted with ethnographic writing. And it's said that culture must be interpreted by the fieldworker, and that it's not visible itself. So culture is not visible itself, but it's made visible through representation. So ethnography is the result of the fieldwork, but it's the written report that must represent the culture. So the document that the ethnographer produces for an audience is what ends up representing the culture, not actually the fieldwork itself. But ethnographies do join fieldwork and culture. So ethnography is always decoding one culture while recoding it for another. The author is really interested in narrative and rhetorical conventions that are the narrative and rhetorical conventions that a writer assumes whenever conducting an ethnography. So the style of the writing is really important, and this is because cultural practices are often shaped by the writing that is done about them. So in this way, the culture is created by the writing, and ethnography becomes a means of representation. In the second chapter of Tales of the Field, there's a discussion about how ethnography was traditionally practiced and how it's practiced among different disciplines. So initially, ethnography, the practice was not really dependent on the personal experiences and the ethnographer kind of coming in face-to-face close contact and immersing themselves within another culture, but ethnography could actually be conducted at home and could be conducted through simple interviews that didn't have to take place in person. But then there was this turn to personal experience in ethnography, and students were urged to just stop relying on secondhand reports and to actually go and do field work themselves and to collect field work, which is best understood and learned by doing. There's a discussion about sociology and anthropology and how their conceptualizations of ethnography are alike but also different. The fundamental distinction here being that anthropologists usually go elsewhere to study their population, but sociologists can kind of do it close to home, traditionally studying populations in urban contexts where they don't have to learn another language or other customs necessarily to study the culture, and generally they know a degree about the culture before they begin their study. But anthropologists, although they still may do some of their work remotely, typically spend longer periods of time away in close, trusting contact with their population, and they might remain tied to this population for an entire career, whereas a sociologist may do one small study and then move to the next. Sociology, ethnography is generally regarded as low budget and somewhat odd and maybe less respectable, but for anthropology, ethnography is the field itself. Their writing style have some differences too, where sociology is typically reported. So the ethnographer at the end of the study simply reports the information, whereas in anthropological writing, it's generally more leisurely literary style and maybe more creative. There's also the difference between the realms in which they choose to study. So sociologists may study more secular, economic, public, political realms, whereas anthropologists may tend to venture into more emotional and sacred, moral and expressive areas of life. There's also stylistic contrasts, so anthropologists may speak often through metaphor, and sociologists don't really have to use that and may have a lot of jargon in their texts as well. The author says that the problem of my concern is going to be with culture and not necessarily between culture and fieldwork, but the ways that each culture and fieldwork are represented to readers by writers of ethnography. So what is the role of the ethnographer as writer is key in Tales of the Field. Not just what's the role of the ethnographer while conducting ethnography, but how does the writing represent culture? What are the politics and ethics that are tied up within that, and how does a writer represent a culture through their writing. Then goes on to discuss different readers of ethnography, saying that when producing an ethnography it's important to know how to tell it, and how you tell it is influenced by who you're telling it to. So the first is talking about college readers, and so when you're writing to an academic community, you probably will use a lot of jargon that the community can understand, and there's some degree of pressure here because you're writing to the audience that knows most about your field. And jargon can be helpful because you're writing to people who understand these terms, but it can also be isolating, and it can create really exclusive boundaries for people who don't understand the terms. There's also social science readers who the author says typically use fieldwork as a method and just a means to an end, so this is only important if it can inform my own research interests, and if it doesn't, then it's not. And then the other population that's discussed is general readers, so when you have like a mass-marketed audience, and in this way an ethnographer becomes a storyteller more than anything when they write for a general audience, and they have an impetus to show cultures more than they do to analyze cultures. But then people in academic circles will often complain that this type of ethnographic account is maybe not even ethnography at all, because it's so simplified and dumbed down. There's also this question that the author poses at the end of the chapter, and the question is whether ethnography is more of a science or if it's more of an art. I imagine will be explored throughout the rest of the book. I'm assuming that there's likely a combination of both that are required, at least from my understanding so far. So that's that. So I think some just main themes across all of it is considering the politics of representation, how culture is created, the importance of maintaining an ethical position as an ethnographer that requires you to acknowledge your own positionality, to engage the other population that you are studying in a dialogic way, and then further to be critical and mindful about the way that you are then going to write about the culture that you studied. So who is your audience? How does knowing your audience change the way that you write? And how does what you write inform and shape the culture that you have been studying? That's all.